Good evening. I'm Dr. Maria Garrett, a faculty member in the Criminal Justice Department and in the Graduate Administration of Justice Department, both of which are excited to sponsor this event this evening. Tonight's presentation will feature Joe D'Ambrosio and Father Neil Kakuthi, who are speakers from Witness to Innocence, a nonprofit agency that works on behalf of death row exonerees. We will hear Joe's story. He was convicted of a brutal murder he did not commit, and in total served 23 years either on death row, incarcerated, under court supervision, prior to being exonerated and released. His appeal process was spearheaded by Father Neil, who became Joe's advocate. Father Neil has a unique background that was instrumental in this case. He is a Catholic priest, a registered nurse, and an attorney. I will let them tell you their story and their words. But before I do, I want to briefly give you a little bit of background information about the death penalty in the United States. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, 32 states and the federal government currently have the death penalty in the U.S. 18 states in Washington, D.C. do not have the death penalty. As of October 2014, there are 3,036 inmates on death row. Pennsylvania is a death penalty state and ranks 5th with the most inmates on death row, counting at 185. And Ohio, where Joe is from, ranks 7th with 144 people currently sitting on death row. On February 23rd, 2015, Pennsylvania Governor Wolf announced a moratorium on the death penalty in Pennsylvania. Since 1973, nationally, there have been 150 individuals exonerated and released from death row, the most recent in December 2014. In Ohio, there have been 6 people released from death row, and Joe is the 6th person to be released in Ohio. The average number of years between being sentenced to death and exoneration is 11 years and 2 months. As you are thinking about these numbers, I do have a few items of housekeeping. Please turn your cell phones off or to silent. A question and answer will be following the presentation. And please note that there were some evaluation forms that were on the seats when you came in. I kindly ask that you fill out that survey and return it to the table by the box office upon your exit. This was required as per Witness to Innocence. Tonight's event fits nicely with the university's Confronting Injustice academic theme. It is also funded by an academic enrichment grant. So without further ado, please welcome Joe D'Ambrosio and Father Neil to Mercyhurst University.
Thank you. I am not the former death row inmate, thank God. The purpose for us to be here tonight is, number one, this is just an amazing story. It's an incredible story. And our purpose is not to, whether you believe the death penalty should stay or whether it should go or whether you're ambivalent about it, that's really not our concern. We obviously have our own approach and our own bent on the death penalty, but what we are going to do is tell you a story, and it's a true story. And it's the story that spans the course of 22 years. And so you have to deal somehow, regardless of how you approach the death penalty, with the truth of the story. And so if this evening does nothing more than cause you to reflect upon the beliefs that you hold or that you cherish and actually reflect upon them in a different way and ask yourself a different set of questions, then I believe that the story will have had a purpose, that 22 years of lost life on death row will not be in vain, and that the death penalty conversation, not only here in Pennsylvania or Ohio, but across the country, will go forth in a very, I hope, reasonable and prudent manner. It's a watershed moment right now about the death penalty in the United States. For many states and across the country as well, the Supreme Court is actually hearing a case this term concerning the botched Oklahoma execution and the drugs that are used currently in lethal injections. The story is one that's of happenstance. It really should not have happened. I didn't seek out Joe D'Ambrosio. I didn't seek out to get involved with anybody on the row. I simply started writing to guys on Ohio's death row back in 1996 at the request of a Carmelite brother from Austin, Texas, who had his own death row pen pal ministry. He had an article written in the National Catholic Reporter. He was seeking pen pals across the country for men and women who were incarcerated across the United States. I sent my name in to him, said, sure, I'll write to a guy. And I received the name of a guy by the name of Keith Hennis on Ohio's death row. Visited with Keith yesterday. He has a July 2016 execution date. And it was Keith who told me about some of the guys in the cells around him. And one of the guys in the cell was Joe D'Ambrosio, was in the cell right next door. That was in 1996 that I heard Joe D'Ambrosio's name mentioned. I never spoke to Joe D'Ambrosio until December of 1998, so over 2 years after I first heard his name.
And it was, like you said, it was just happenstance that the guy in the cell next to me was one of my friends that we used to work out together and everything else. And we would talk about our cases, and I was telling him about mine and how messed up it was. And it was just godsend is really what it is, because he needed to be all three things that he was to do exactly what he did for me. If he was only two of them, it wouldn't have worked. And there is no other priest in the world with all three credentials, and it just so happens that he's writing the man in the cell next to me who says, you think my case is messed up, you need to talk to the guy in the cell next to me. And it went from there.
But I couldn't talk to Joe, right? I mean, because if you're going to have access to a death row inmate, you just don't have access to a death row inmate. You must be on the death row inmates visiting list if you are able to have any kind of contact with him or her. And I was not on Joe's visiting list. I was on Keith's visiting list. And while I could see Joe in the rec yard playing basketball, or I could peer in the food slot of his locked door, I was not allowed to have any time talking to him. But in December of 1998, I was reading the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and I was perusing the obituary page. And I noticed the name of Dorothy D'Ambrosio, and I knew that Dorothy was Joe's mother. And I knew that Joe would not be allowed to attend Dorothy's funeral services. General population inmates can attend family funerals under guard with transportation and protection supplied by the family if they can afford it. But death row inmates go nowhere under any circumstances. So Joe was not going to his mother's funeral. So I just thought, out of a common courtesy, that I would attend the wake service for Dorothy D'Ambrosio, and that I would celebrate the funeral mass the next day. And so I did. Didn't know Joe, didn't know Dorothy, didn't know any of the family. And when I went down to visit Keith on death row a number of weeks later, it was either latter part of December 1998, early 1999, I ended my visit with Keith Hennis early, and I asked the corrections officers if they would bring Joe out of his cell so that I could help him achieve some sense of closure over the loss of his mother that he could not be there for. They did not have to do that. They did, and I suspect that they did so because Joe was well liked by the other inmates and by the corrections officers. And so they gave me, I think they allotted me maybe 20 to 30 minutes to visit with Joe.
And I wasn't expecting this, and out of the blue, they tell me I have an attorney visit. So I walk out there, and there he is. Now, up to this point, I've already been down. I actually was arrested in 1988. This is now 1998. And up to this point, I was asking from everybody to help me. Innocent projects, journalism schools, law schools, the media, anybody and everybody. I even wrote Oprah, begging for help. She didn't answer, of course, and neither did anyone else.
I wrote Oprah, too.
She didn't answer the priest either. So now, all of a sudden, when you visit a death row inmate, you're locked in a room. Now, he's locked in a room with me. I have a human being in front of me. And he's sitting there trying to tell me about my mother's death. And I was kind of cold about it. I said, fine and good, thank you, but she's dead. I'm alive. Help me. Nobody will help me. I didn't do this, and they're trying to murder me for something I didn't do. And he was like, because you have to understand, most death penalty cases are volumes long, 10, 15, 20 volumes long. Each volume is 500 pages wide. Now we're talking double space, legal type. There's very little. And I'm trying to sit there and talk him into helping me, and he keeps trying to talk about my mother's funeral. And we kept going back and forth, back and forth. She's dead. Sorry to say it, but I'm alive, and they're trying to put me where she is. And I was like, help me. And he wouldn't.
You have to understand, I was a newly ordained priest at the time, and I was in a new assignment in a parish of several thousand families, and I did not have the time to dedicate to working on anybody's criminal appeals or to investigate their case. And I do know the volumes and volumes and volumes of the trial transcript. He's just talking to you about the trial transcript. Most of them are 15 volumes of 500-something pages apiece. He's not even indicating to you 10 years of appellate work that had been done on his case, going through the Ohio District Court, the Ohio Supreme Court, and then beginning to work through the federal appellate process. So we're not talking just the volumes of the trial transcript. We're talking tons and tons and tons of paperwork. And I just did not have the time. Nor did I really get involved on death row so that I could do any kind of legal work for the guys. I simply wanted to be a companion to some of the men as they journeyed from the crime they committed until the time they were executed. It wasn't to be voyeuristic. It wasn't to do anything. It was just to be with another human being. And yet he's pleading with me. And then he tells me in the court, in the context of that visit, that his trial transcript for a capital case is 1 volume long.
Not even a volume.
It stopped me in my tracks. Somebody's life is on the line, and the record that literally historicizes that event in the United States justice system is 1 volume. And he didn't tell you that he has the shortest capital case in Ohio history.
2 3/4 days from let's start until you die.
So what was I going to do? I mean, I was so curious about that I agreed to take his trial transcript home. Now you've seen, if you have seen legal transcripts, they're, the margins are wide and it's double spaced and it's easy reading if you can get past the legalese. And so I did. I took it home that night and I read it entirely in one night. And by the end of my reading of that trial transcript, I knew at least one thing was wrong, and that was the coroner's testimony. And I knew that it was wrong because, as you heard, I had 15 years of experience as a critical care registered nurse in a trauma unit. And what caught my attention right away was that Anthony Clan, 19-year-old that was killed in this case, brutally murdered. Anthony Clan was sliced from ear to ear and then had 3 large stab wounds in his torso. When he was mortally wounded, they did not, when they severed his neck, they did not sever either carotid arteries or jugular veins. Somehow they missed them completely. But what they did do was they opened up 2 large holes in this man's trachea. And then the coroner testified that after these 2 large holes were created, this man was screaming for his life. Now, it's pretty common sense. You don't have to be a registered nurse to know this. But when the trachea is compromised, and I worked with compromised tracheas for 15 years every day, you cannot vocalize. If it's a surgical created opening, you might be able to plug it with your finger, and you might sound something like this. But this guy had 2 holes, massive holes, and he was under attack. So he's not running down a creek bed trying to plug holes and screaming. And then subsequently I found out that the coroner testified that there were over 650 milliliters of blood in his mediastinum, in his lungs. So if Anthony was doing anything at the creek bed that day, it was drowning in his own secretions. It was not screaming for his life. And so I knew immediately that something was wrong. And the first question I asked was, what else might be wrong? And so it started my... It got me curious. It didn't start an investigative process right away because, they're all innocent, right? Some of them are. But I didn't want to commit myself to working on his case right away because as I was investigating, I also saw some things that just caused me to be a little bit concerned about the veracity of the story that he was telling me. And so I would go back to death row and I would sit with him again. I actually had my name put on his visitor list as an attorney of record so that I would have easy, open access to him without guards present and that we could have face-to-face confidential conversations. And every time I came to him and say, well, wait a minute, what about this? What about this? What about this? He would tell me this, this, and this. And then I would go back and I would investigate what he told me.
He wouldn't believe me.
I wouldn't believe him. Would you? Right? No, you wouldn't. If you're prudent, if you're just got common sense, you want to investigate what the man is saying, and you want to see that what he is. You want to prove it for yourself. So, and I did. I listened to what he had to say. I was the only one listening to what he had to say at that time, and then I would take what he told me, and I would go back. And I would investigate what he told me, and I would find out 10 years, 11 years, 12 years after the fact that the things that he was telling me were verifiably true. And so I did go back to death row on one particular day, and I said to him, listen, Joe, if you ever lie to me, we're done.
One little bit.
I will work with you. I will work with you. I'll be your advocate. You need an advocate on the outside. You are not doing this as an incarcerated inmate without help on the outside. And so I said, I will be your voice, I will be your advocate, but if I find one incident where you're lying to me, we're done.
And now he's stuck with me.
That's more true than you know. So what did we find? And there becomes the big question. Because one of the first things that I tried to do was what he was trying to do behind bars, is to get media attention to the case. Media is all about death row cases while they are being litigated, but they want nothing to do with the case or the inmate once he has been convicted and incarcerated. So try to get media attention to these cases is near impossible. So I enlisted a guy by the name of Martin Coos, who wrote a story in a weekly magazine, Cleveland Scene magazine.
Which is a free magazine.
You just pull it out of the newsstand, and there it is. He and I started working together. And then I eventually discovered a couple things. Got this letter, because when I started investigating, I started stepping on toes that I really probably shouldn't have been stepping on, and it really got a lot of people irate and angry. And this letter came to me from the lead detective in the case, who was livid that I was investigating the case and I wasn't talking to prosecutors or detectives. He excoriates me for not having any kind of investigatory experience. He excoriates me for putting my nose where it doesn't belong. And he tells me, as the arresting and investigating officer, I was a Cleveland police officer for 28 years, 21 of them as a homicide detective. I think this experience enables me to know who is guilty and who is not, including Joe. I have 5 other men on death row that were my cases, as though that's a badge of honor. A ton of work was and is done to make sure we prosecute the right people. I take pride in the work that I've done, and as each year on the force went by, I became more streetwise. In this case, there were 3 suspects, no more, no less, and certainly no one else. What experience do you have in investigating murders, Neil? And he says, if you thought Joe was innocent, don't you think he would have taken the stand in his own defense? Well, Mr. Detective, you were in the courtroom. You know that he did take the stand in his own defense. So what did we discover? Well, besides the wound and the coroner's report, there was a day that I took off. It was a Thursday. That was my day off from the parish. So I was running into roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And so one day I decided that I was going to take all of the very important names in the case. And I was going to go down to the Justice Center, and I was going to go into their library, and I was going to investigate the criminal histories of the chief characters in this case. Joe D'Ambrosio, Mike Keenan, Eddie Espinoza, Paul Lewis, and Anthony Klan, the deceased. And so I pulled every one of their criminal jackets. And in the days of microfiche, and I've got sitting there behind the machine for hours and hours and hours. And I didn't really discover anything. I knew about prior rapes on some of their parts. I knew about long-standing drug histories and whatnot, but nothing that was not known before. Until I thought, well, maybe I'll just skip the deceased's file because he's dead. He doesn't have a criminal history. But I thought, you know what? No, I'm going to look at it. And so I put his file underneath the microfiche scanner. And as I'm scanning through it, I find a page where the deceased was a witness to a murder, or I'm sorry, a witness to a rape in May of 1988. And then I investigate a little bit longer, and I find that, surprisingly, I found the name of the rape victim. The rape victim was a young man by the name of Christopher Longenecker. And Christopher Longenecker was Anthony Klan's roommate. Thus, Anthony walked in inadvertently while the rape was being committed, allowing Christopher the chance to escape. Christopher is blind, and Christopher has cerebral palsy. And so he was being raped. Anthony Klan walks in. The rape is interrupted. Christopher escapes. He goes immediately to the police. The police take him to the local hospital. They do a rape kit. And then they list the name of the rapist. A guy by the name of Paul Lewis with the nickname of Stony. You can let your imagination take you in the appropriate place there. Stony Lewis. Paul Stony Lewis was the rapist. That's important because it was Paul Stony Lewis who would later call the county morgue, asking, by the way, Anthony Klan is called as a witness in the case by the defense and by the state. He's the only guy that witnessed it. So both sides call him as a witness. And so Paul Lewis is arrested in May of 1988. He is indigent. He's sitting in county jail in Cuyahoga County for summer of 1988. Christopher Longenecker is subpoenaed for one of the pretrial hearings. Christopher, I told you, is blind. He can read like this. And so Christopher Longenecker gets his subpoena, and he shows up at the pretrial hearing on August 11th, 1988. He misread it. He was supposed to have been there on August 1st. Since he did not show up, they released Paul Lewis for want of prosecution. There is only one witness who has been called to testify against him. He has a previous rape conviction. If he's convicted of rape again, he's going away for a long, long time. Anthony Klan ends up dead, and the case is gone away. Paul Lewis is the one who calls the morgue and asks if there is a body there. And then he begins to describe wounds on the body that nobody would have known of because there had been no public mention of them. He describes accurately wounds on the deceased. How would you know that if you weren't the guy that put the wounds there to begin with? So we found the rape case. And the rape case started opening up all sorts of different evidentiary problems all the way along.
One of the things that we found when we were looking into this is when Anthony's body was found, it was found in a creek. He was killed on Saturday morning. And the two detectives that went to get the body out of the creek searched the whole area looking for any signs of anything. Now, like Father Neil said, he was cut from ear to ear and had 3 stab wounds in his chest. They found 0 blood on the creek bed edge. All along the creek bed, there was bushes, trees, and shrubs. Now, he was killed Saturday morning. Saturday, by noontime, the body was found. There was no disturbance along that creek edge. It rained the day before, so the ground was wet. There was no tire tracks on the ground. There was no sign of anything going on at that creek except for the body being face down in the water. The 2 detectives put this into a report. Lo and behold, these 2 were not the ones that took the case over. They were not the head detectives in the case. Another detective that was at the morgue when Anthony's body was identified was the one that actually took the case. And they hid these 2 reports from these 2 detectives that had over 50 years of experience together. That was another piece of the evidence that they withheld from me.
And the report concluded, both of these, and these detectives were later called at a retrial hearing to testify that both of them had determined that the young man had been killed at another location and dumped at the creek, but he had not been killed at the creek bed.
But that totally contradicted. When I got arrested, I was arrested with one other fella who was the foreman of a landscaping company I worked for less than a month. When we got arrested, the foreman spilled his guts, said that he stood there and watched while me and another man murdered this kid. And he said it all happened at the creek. Well, that totally contradicted what these two detectives said when they found the body. So they had to hide those 2 reports from those detectives for that exact reason. And when Stoney actually called the morgue about the wounds on his hand, he did that anonymously. He just called in and said, "Do you have a body? Is he about 19? Does he have these wounds?" And the morgue worker told him, "Well, yes, we do. Why don't you come down and identify him?" And he hung up. Come to find out, we found out in a police report about this phone call, and it said that it was anonymous, but then they had his name written above the top of it, Paul Stoney Lewis. So they knew it was him. But they hid that report from us for 15 years. When Espinoza was the foreman of the landscaping company, there was also the owner of the landscaping company was Mike Keenan. These are the 3 defendants in this case. When Espinoza instantly told them this report or his story, it didn't match what the police were finding out. Within 24 hours, the police went back to him and had him swear out another affidavit, this time matching what the evidence was that they were finding. And they changed it totally. I mean, everything from the day it happened to how it happened and who was all there. It's totally 2 total different ones, and they're both in the record now.
They needed him to retrofit his story to protect their theory of the case. What they didn't do was to hide the first affidavit. Both affidavits are in the file, and they are diametrically opposed to each other, and yet they were both sworn out within a 24-hour time period. And they give different dates, times, places, and everything by the same guy. He says, "Oh yeah, I may have gotten this wrong. I may have forgotten this," and totally changes his story in order to retrofit the police theory of the case.
And another major thing that they hid from us is the day that I was arrested, there was a known informant that was in the county jail at the same time by the name of Angelo Creamy. Angelo Creamy called his handler on the phone in the prison, which are all recorded. He told his handler, "You have the wrong guy. Look elsewhere." And the only reason we know that this tape exists or that he said this was there was one line in a police report that they hid from us for 15 years. When we finally got the report, we went to the judge and said, "Well, we need the tape." And she asked the prosecutor, "Well, where's the tape?" And he says, "We can't find it." She said, "Well, who was the last to sign it out?" She said, "The prosecutor's office." Right around the time that we found out that Angelo Creamy made this tape, Angelo Creamy died. So we couldn't even go to him and ask him, "How did you know? What did you know? Who do you know?" Anything about that. So as and the evidence just goes on and on.
And that's the key point here. You can take this case, which was tried and convicted in early 1989, and you can make it an appeal, but the courts have something that's called harmless error. And they'll look at your case and they'll say, "Oh, you know what, you're right. There's a piece of evidence here that was really mishandled or handled inappropriately, but even so, and it should not have been admitted, but even so, there's still enough material to convict you." And Ohio has perfected the harmless error doctrine. So as long as the courts think that the evidence that you're complaining about is harmless to your case, that you would have been convicted nonetheless, they're going to let the conviction stand.
So you could have 1, 2, 3 pieces of evidence that were mishandled, and they'll still call it harmless error.
And that's the travesty of this case, because the federal courts get this case now. And they were astonished, first and foremost, by the rape. And the rape is even more astonishing because the rape was being prosecuted by Carmen Marino. He was the prosecutor of Cuyahoga County at the time. And in the rape case, there's Paul Lewis, Christopher Longenecker, Anthony Klan. Carmen Marino simultaneously is prosecuting this murder case. And there's Anthony Klan, Paul Lewis, Christopher Longenecker. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute. This is the exact same time. The same weeks and months and everything, the same prosecutor, the same people in the case. And he says, "Yeah, I never saw any connection there." It's like, seriously, dude? I mean, no connection? Is it asking too much that you can put the names on 2 cases that you're handling simultaneously together at the same time and ask some questions? And he didn't.
Didn't want to.
And CNN just did an episode on Joe, an hour-long documentary on Joe, and they interviewed him. And he says, he says, "I didn't see anything there." He says, "Seriously, who would kill somebody just to prevent them from testifying?" You've never heard of a witness protection program? That's what it's all about. And yet that's what he's saying. This is public. And so the federal courts looked at this rape. And the federal courts looked at a few of these other things, the affidavits of the 2 investigating original detectives who said he wasn't killed there, and they said, whoa, there's so much here that this isn't simply harmless error anymore. There's so much here that this literally calls into question the constitutionality of this conviction, and it cannot stand. And so the federal courts, and we'll get to a little bit more of it because there are some pieces that are extremely interesting here, if what we had already is not interesting. The federal judge said, in order for justice to be done here, this late in the game, the prosecutor, police, and coroner must give Joe D'Ambrosio's defense team everything in their possession.
Unredacted.
And it must be unredacted. They have to give him everything. They can't hold anything back. And it was when the files came in from the police, the prosecutor, and the coroner that all sorts of other evidence begins to pour out. So Joe will tell you, 80% of the evidence that freed him was in existence all along. They had it in 1988 and 1989, and they failed to turn it over, as they are required by law and ethical guidelines to hand over anything that is of impeachment or exculpatory value. And it was in their files all this time. And the federal judge said, in her opinion, reversing Joe's sentence and conviction and expunging his record, that had the trial court had this information in front of them in 1989, no reasonable fact finder would have found him guilty. No reasonable fact finder would have found him guilty. She said this in 2006. Now, we put the evidence in front of her, mind you, in 2003. She issued her opinion in 2006. It would be another 6 years later before he actually walked free as an exonerated man. 23 years. 23 years with evidence in their files that shows that, not only shows that he doesn't do it, I'm going to tell you this, the evidence convicts, but it convicts Paul Lewis and Eddie Espinoza.
The two people pointing their fingers at me.
Eddie Espinoza is now dead. Paul Lewis lives in South Bend, Indiana. So here's another major piece of evidence. There was a mix-up of the days. Did this murder occur Thursday night, Friday morning, or did it occur Friday night, Saturday morning? And the state wanted to say that it occurred, they told the story about Joe that it occurred on Thursday night, Friday morning. And yet there's a woman, her name is Teresa Farinacci. Teresa Farinacci lives today in the same home that she lived in when the time of these events occurred in 1988, 1989. Teresa Farinacci knows exactly the day she's talking about, without question. She was attending her niece's wedding rehearsal and dinner on Friday night. She comes home late Friday night, early Saturday morning, after the party and everything is over. She enters her own home. This is in Little Italy in Cleveland, Ohio. The homes are right next to each other in small little alleys. She enters her home and she's startled because there's a violent altercation taking place in the home next to her. She hears things crashing. She hears people screaming. So much so is she concerned that she calls the police and the police respond. It's in the logs. When the police arrive at Teresa's home, lights are out, nothing's crashing, nobody's screaming, and it's early in the morning. And so the police don't knock on doors, they don't call anybody, they don't investigate anything, and everybody goes to bed. Next day, Teresa Farinacci is coming out of her house. She's now on the way to the wedding itself. She looks out to the front drive, the road in front of the house, and she sees a truck parked out in front of the house. And in the bed of the truck is the deceased, Anthony Clan. And Anthony dated her daughter for a short period of time. That's part of the problem. It seems like Anthony dated everybody's daughter for a short period of time. But Anthony dated her daughter, so she knew Anthony. And she calls out a greeting to him, and Anthony does not respond. So she calls to Anthony a second time. Anthony does not respond because he's dead in the back of that truck. And he had been killed in a violent altercation in the early hours of the morning. She says that she wishes she had gone over to the bed of the truck to see why he wasn't responding. She just simply thought he was drunk. But she had a wedding to be to, and so she did not. And they re-interviewed her in in the summer of 2009 when Joe's case was being readied for retrial. And the federal marshal sat down with her, and the federal marshal said, "So you think you saw Anthony's body in the back of that truck?" And she kind of flew off the handle and says, you're not listening to me. She said, "I don't think I saw Anthony's body. I know I saw Anthony's body."
And to the point, the marshal actually had her call the niece on the phone to ask her when she was married, because they wouldn't believe the dates until she actually said it herself.
Who do you think lives in the home where the violent altercation took place? Paul Stoney Lewis. There's also an affidavit from another elderly couple who lived in the apartment, but on a second level, who testified, or at least in affidavit form, they mentioned to the police that they had heard somebody say, "We need to dump the body in the basement," on the night of the violent altercation in question. So the rape, the date, the time, there's a barmaid who what's her name? Linda de Blasio.
Yeah.
Linda de Blasio was a barmaid down there in the area at the time. And she has testified that Anthony came in and she served Anthony at her bar on Friday night, 24 hours after the state said that Joe had killed him. She had served him a drink at the bar.
And lend him money for taxi
Gave
fare.
him cab money.
Yep.
Tell him about the clothes.
There was a piece of paper in some of the paperwork, just a normal size, regular writing paper, and there was a T across it. Over on one side was my name, other side of the T was Ed Espinosa's name. Height, weight, measurements, height, weight, measurements. Well, I'm 6'2", 210 pounds. Ed Espinosa's 5'6", 120 pounds. Underneath it says bloody clothes found in Keenan's garage and a question mark. Those clothes were never entered into evidence. Reason being, it would have been an OJ moment. Because I would have been like, let me put them on. Bring them. Let me try to put somebody that's 5'6" a pair of their pants on. When I came back for retrial and we found out about this, we asked, where's the bloody clothes? They said they can't find them, along with everything else except for my hunting knives that they took when I got arrested. I was a sportsman, and it was September, so I was getting ready for deer season. I had 3 large knives.
Which is one of the
Admittedly so.
reasons I didn't believe him at first, by the way. When you see pictures of big hunting knives that were confiscated from the defendant's apartment.
Well, one of them's 14 inches long, 2.5 inches wide. It's a deer gutting knife. Back in 1988, they took those 3 knives and they tested them. Back then, they didn't have mitochondrial DNA testing. All they had was blood grouping testing. They took all 3 knives to their lab. They tested them, and they came back negative for human blood. Didn't stop them at trial waving these things around, calling them the murder weapons. Now it's time for the retrial. One of the few pieces of evidence they had left were the knives. So again, they took it with today's technology and took it to their labs. Not only did they test the knives, they took the handles off the knives. They tested under the handles. They tested the handles themselves. They took the sheaths apart, took scrapings and tested that. Nothing. Not one little bit of DNA, human DNA, was found. And yet to this day, they wave these 3 knives around and say they're the murder weapons. They made a circus out of my retrial. They challenged the judge, trying to get her thrown off because she was making them follow the law. And prosecutors in Cleveland aren't used to judges making them do that. So they fabricated a document saying that she was my co-defendant's attorney and tried to have her thrown off. They took that all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court, and the Ohio Supreme Court said no. She didn't represent them. Yet they fabricated a document saying she was. That's how far they were willing to go with their lies and cheat and steal and destroy of evidence just to railroad me one more time.
And the federal judge looked at this. She threw out the conviction, threw out the sentence, expunged the record, and said, State of Ohio, you have 180 days to either retry him or set him free. So they decided that they're going to do the retrial, right? And so we're underneath all these pretrial hearings that are happening. And as we're going through this entire 6-month process, the state is saying, we're ready to take him to trial. We're ready today, Honor, to go to trial. We're going to convict him again. We got the witnesses lined up. We're ready to go, Your Honor. We're ready to go to trial. So it's now 5 days before trial. And 2 important things happened. Number one, the judge asked the prosecutor how many witnesses they had subpoenaed for the trial. None. Not a single one. And it's only 5 days before the trial is to commence. They didn't have any witnesses any longer to subpoena. And then on that very day, the state approached the bench and indicated to the judge that as we were winding down here, that the state had now given to Mr. D'Ambrosio's defense team every single piece of evidence in their possession. Nothing was held back. They had it all. Well, with that assertion, the judge went to lunch. We took an hour, maybe a little over an hour break. When we came back from lunch, there was a commotion that was going on up in the front of the courtroom. And the commotion was that the state, somewhat reluctantly, as you can imagine, approached the bench and let the judge know that over the lunch hour, they had discovered 4 more pieces of evidence.
Oh, wait, it gets better. It was in a closet that they have not been in 22 years. Now, this is the Justice Center, and they found this magic closet that they haven't been in 22 years, and it was DNA evidence, along with other evidence.
So what was in there was swabs. There were supposed to be swabs in there that were taken from the cheek of the decedent. When they opened the envelope, the swabs were missing. There was a soil sample that they had collected from the supposed crime scene. The soil sample tested negative for blood.
The other one was the truck.
There was a soil sample from the truck bed where the body was transported in, negative for blood. We could talk about the condition of the body. We don't have enough time. But there were things on autopsy that showed that the body had to have been dead and on its back for at least 45 minutes so that the blood could settle there. There were scrape marks on the back indicating that the body had been dragged. All of those kinds of things that never came up at first either. But, and now the judge has no other recourse but to put the trial on hold so that the defense can examine the evidence against him, which puts the trial outside the 180-day time period. So the state goes back to federal court, asks for an extension of the 180 days, which the federal court denies. So Joe has literally got his habeas corpus, a grant of habeas corpus. He's a free man, but she does not prevent the state from retrying him, rearresting him, reindicting him, and retrying him. But she put a stay on her own order, a 15-day stay so that the parties can appeal or whatever they want to do. Within that 15 days, Eddie Espinoza dies. The state knew of Eddie Espinoza's death within 2 days. He died on April 27th, 2009. The state, knowing that, withheld even that information and did not let Joe's attorneys or the court, either state or federal court, know that Eddie Espinoza had died until July of 2009. So when the federal judge got that information, she said, had I known that the eyewitness against Joe is now dead and that the state had that information and did not share it with anybody, she said, I would have barred his reprosecution. So she did. She barred his reprosecution. The state appealed that to the Sixth Circuit Court in Cincinnati. The Sixth Circuit Court in Cincinnati, very conservative court, upheld her decision. The state appealed that to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court refused to hear the case, which then left Joe totally and forever exonerated in January of 2012. Just an enormous, you can't make this stuff up. It was unbelievable.
And there's so much more we could go into.
It was unbelievable for 22 years for this to go on. And if you were sitting there in the courtroom while these retrial proceedings were happening, you would have been absolutely flabbergasted.
The judge, when she released me, actually said on the record to the prosecutors, "You tried to make a circus out of my court. You failed."
They did a pretty good job, though.
Yes.
It was pretty much of a circus.
It was bad.
So that's where we're at. And, he's been free for since January of 2012. We do this kind of things to try to bring light, not just to the death penalty. The death penalty happens to be the focus, the instrument by which this story is told. But the damnation is that this can happen in our justice system. The judge said this as she freed him. She said, "Although perhaps not swift in this case, justice did prevail." I disagree. Justice does not keep an innocent man in prison for 22 years. So I've got a couple other things to do, but I want to take some questions because there may be questions you have, points that you're unclear of, and it would be good for us to at least hit some of the questions up here. And we can't really see too much, so.
Yes, ma'am.
Why? Why did the prosecutor's office go at you with such a vengeance? And why did they just doggedly refuse to see anything? I mean, was there something you did in the past? Is there some history that they had? Or were they pleasing somebody? Did somebody else get to them? Were they pleasing somebody else? Or why?
Well, I was never in trouble before with the law until this happened. I was an honorably discharged sergeant out of the military. I didn't know any attorneys. I didn't know any police. I didn't know any prosecutors. It was wrong place, wrong time, working for the wrong guy, and I just got swept up in this. The reason I think that they dogged it during the retrial was the second chair prosecutor of my trial, when I came back for a retrial, was the head prosecutor of the county when I came back. And he's the one got caught with his hand in the cookie jar, hiding the evidence. So he was going to take this as far as he could, any way that he could, no matter what, because he didn't want his record blemished. Why the cops did it, to this day, I cannot say. I have theories, but there's no clear evidence. It wasn't like I was a known drug dealer or something. Like I said, I was never in trouble before. I was Joe Common. I was like any of you. No record, no nothing, honorably discharged. I did 4 years in the military.
I think that the lawyer at the time of the trial had access to all of the evidence. So he knew what was in the trial, and he knew what was in the files, and he knew that it was not divulged as it should have been. So when it comes back for retrial, and he is now the county prosecutor, he has a vested interest to try to keep that from coming to the fore. And so he took it all the way up through the United States Supreme Court. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, which at one time was a staunchly pro-advocate editorial paper, has completely switched their opinion. They've advocated for Joe, and for years, Joe was in the Cleveland Plain Dealer with the board and the editors calling for the prosecutor to drop this losing case. They even questioned why. And we don't really have an answer to that, so all we can do is speculate. But you got to remember, this is the case was tried in the late 1980s. The death penalty had just come back in the late 1970s. Prosecutors and police and coroners were all gung-ho on trying capital cases, making sure that they stick to make the death penalty a source to be reckoned with once again in the states. Cleveland has a lot of guys on the roll from that same time period with the same prosecutors that I think we should be looking at.
Initially, it was the woe is me. How can this happen? Beat my head up against the wall until I got sick and tired of bloodying my head and getting headaches. Then I was like, you know what? I've got to learn the law. I have to use what they used against me to gain my freedom. So I taught myself the law, and I immersed myself in the law. During school, I wasn't very good. I barely passed high school. So to learn the law was such an uphill battle because, as you know, it's got its own dictionary. It has its own language. I was having trouble with English, let alone learning another language on top of it. But it was the only thing I saw that could help me free myself. So between teaching myself the law and my military background and the way I was raised was what kept me sane. Well, unless you listen to him, then I'm not so sane. But mainly that was that. It was that I was, I just immersed myself in my case, trying to do everything and learn everything and figure a way to file it and get it in the courts before it got lost. Another question.
Somebody way in the back.
Do we think this was more of a case for the evidence being lost, or not? Because there's a lot of cases that in the Innocence Project that came out, that evidence was lost during the time period that it first, like, for a lot of the cases that ended up on death row. Do you think it's more of a problem with that part of the justice system, where evidence tends to be lost during that time? Because what I'm hearing most is that it was a problem with, like, our lawyers, police officers, and then you just end up on death row.
I think it's a combination of both of those things. I think that there was a lot of prosecutorial misconduct. The evidence was not lost. The evidence was
At
in
first.
the files. So the clothes were no longer in existence. There was a tape that was missing, but there was paperwork in the files to indicate that those clothes had existed and that they had been tested. There was paperwork in the file to indicate that an informant had called to indicate that the wrong people had been arrested. So those things were in the file. And so it wasn't a matter that it was lost. It was just not handed over. So there was some prosecutorial misconduct there. There was prosecutorial misconduct in the retrial from the standpoint of just making this a circus and obfuscating all the way along rather than seeking the truth for Anthony Klan and his family. So it was prosecutorial misconduct. It was the hiding of evidence, a combination of all of that stuff that made this go bad.
Yes.
Have any of the prosecutors been prosecuted? Because I know that in similar cases in Illinois, there are some death row cases, there are some prosecutors who were, I think, in jail to this day, where they certainly had multi-year sentences for hiding evidence.
The question is, are the prosecutors being held accountable in any way at this point in time?
No. They have a thing called sovereign immunity. To beat the sovereign immunity is such an uphill battle, it's ridiculous. Plus, there's been recent cases that have been ruled upon that make it almost impossible to go after them in any way, shape, or form.
Joe did file a federal lawsuit and a state lawsuit seeking compensation. The federal lawsuit went all the way up through the United States Supreme Court and was denied earlier this year. The state lawsuit is still in progress, but doesn't look likely. Way back there.
But couldn't the prosecutors still be subject to some type of disciplinary proceedings through the Bar Association?
The question is, can't the prosecutor still be subject to some kind of disciplinary proceedings via the Bar Association? The answer is yes. There's a question of standing, of who has standing to bring that before the Bar Association and the Supreme Court. The trial judge herself has made some noise about whether she might take that path, because they did try to falsely accuse her of representing a co-defendant and have her thrown off the case. And while some of that may still be in the works down the road, a lot of that is kind of being held back in abeyance until we find out what happens with civil litigation. Somebody had their hand up here.
Yeah. Two questions. First, do you think organized crime was involved at all in the corruption that you guys witnessed with the police and prosecutors? And then also, what was the biggest challenge from being institutionalized in a facility for so long and then moving back out into the general population?
The organized crime aspect, I really don't see. They had a problem back in the late 80s. They were bragging about having an 82% conviction rate. And they were doing everything and anything in their power to keep that, because they were bragging that they were the best in the country and blah, blah, blah. It didn't matter if you were innocent or not. They just wanted their convictions. As for the biggest challenge that I had coming out was technology. When I went in, computers were ran on punch cards. They were the size of this area, and only the rich people had them. I didn't know any rich people. Cell phones were the size of car batteries. You used to have to sling it over your shoulder. You had a thing you used to carry it on. It was just huge.
The old bag phones.
Yeah, the old bag phones. The World Wide Web didn't exist. So for me to get out, and the computer itself scares me. It really, really does. The technology that's in that and the things that you can do with it are just, it's amazing to me. I'm learning it, but it's slow. Because, like I said, I didn't have a clue. When I first got out, they gave me a cell phone, and my one attorney was down in Columbus. And he sent me a text with a picture on it, and it just amazed me. I was like, how does he do that? What do you mean he just took that picture and he's sending it to me?
That was the actual day. It was less than a few hours after he had gotten out.
Yeah.
He had gotten out to be sent to somebody's home for a year of house arrest. And so the attorney in Columbus couldn't be present for the morning's hearing, and sent Joe a congratulatory text and a picture. And of course it dinged, and Joe didn't know what the ding was on the phone, and so I showed him, and this picture pops up, and he's like, he sent me a picture by the phone? I mean, he was just dumbfounded.
When I went in, you still had to take the roll of film to the guy. They had to develop it. You had to wait a week, and then you'd get it back.
And I said, Joe, why don't you take one of yourself? Take a selfie, Joe. And send it to your attorney. And he's like, no way. So yeah, that was interesting.
All the way in the back.
Just a question for clarification. When you said the neighbor saw Anthony's body in the truck, but he was cut from ear to ear and had stabbed, did she not see his face, or what did she see?
We'd have to ask her about that, but she was seeing him from a distance. So it wasn't like she was close up upon him.
And I'm guessing his head wasn't back. I'm thinking it's forward because she thought he was sleeping, and you really couldn't see the neck wound.
And there's some other things too that, I mean, we can't tell you everything in the course of an hour, but Anthony was, when they found his body, he was wearing no socks, no underwear, and he was wearing no shoes, no socks, no shoes, no underwear. And so the speculation was that he had to have been in a different state of dress, and they just dressed him hurriedly to dispose of his body. What was very interesting is that there was a T-shirt that he was wearing, and Anthony's torso has 3 stab wounds in it, but the T-shirt has 2. And so we don't know how that happened or what. That the T-shirt does not contain all of the stab wounds that the torso does. We believe that he was stabbed once, and then they were dressing him again, and then they stabbed him in their anger or whatnot, that they stabbed him an additional 2 times. There is, and we hope to find this out pretty soon too, there's a photograph of the Paul Lewis apartment that looks like there's quite a bit of blood in the photograph that was never tested or anything, and so we're kind of working with that right now. to see if that still might glow with a luminol study.
Yes. Yes. I'm trying to get from every corner.
How, I'm sure the media was not on your side at all when it first occurred and everything. How was the media portraying everything during the retrial?
Actually, during the first trial, there was only one little article written. Well, there was the initial article of when the body was first
It
found.
wasn't much.
Yeah, but after that, all there was when I was convicted. That was it. When I came back for the retrial, they, as Father Neil said, the newspaper and the TV they couldn't understand why they were going after this. The plain dealer begged the prosecutor to leave the case alone because it's a dog. And yet they kept going and going and going.
The plain dealer was staunchly in his corner.
They actually used my case to get open discovery in Ohio. They used mine as the poster child for the reason to have open discovery. Because most of the reasons why all this was hidden back in '88 is back then the prosecutor was allowed to take his file, he would read it, and he would show the defense attorneys what they thought was pertinent. And that was the rule up until my retrial when they actually pushed and got open discovery in Ohio. Yes.
So you never even met the murder victim?
Like 2 times. I knew everybody in this case, everyone that's involved in this case, I knew for less than a month.
But you didn't know him well, they had no motive?
The motive they told me is because the owner of the landscaping company told me to. Even though I was an honorably discharged sergeant that was running a motor pool when I got out, they said my motive was because the owner of the landscaping company told me to.
And how old were you when you were convicted, and do you feel?
26.
So you're only 26, so do you feel there's any part of your life that they irrevocably took away, and are you still angry?
They've taken every aspect of my life away. I can't get a job. If it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have a job. I work for him. I can't get an apartment. I can't get a loan. I can't even get a credit card.
Can't get a date.
What was that? That's true. Very true. But no.
Joe and I talk frequently around the country and everything, and we often share, well, we do. We just share a hotel room, and I sleep with one eye open. Just joking. Yes. Yeah.
I just got 2 questions. If you were expunged, because like I know like when felons get out, they have trouble finding a job, but your record was expunged, so how can employers like legally keep you from a job?
Google my name.
That's really?
Yeah,
Google my name.
expungement is a
Means
moral
nothing.
victory.
Nothing.
It's a moral victory, and it's a great victory, but it's just a moral victory. I mean, you literally Google his name, and everything comes up.
Everything.
The
You can't
court
get around
paper, the trial transcripts, the appellate transcripts, everything comes up. It's just all right there.
Well, you can't get rid of it. Once it's on the web, it's there forever.
Like a case like yours, because there are a lot more cases like yours, it just like makes me feel like we don't live in a just society. Like our justice system is supposed to protect us from people who've done bad things. They're not supposed to incarcerate innocent people. And like I know some people fall through the cracks, but clearly your case is like you didn't do it. So like how, even back then, like they didn't have the technology they have today, but like still how, like I just blows my mind that you were even convicted in the first place.
I am the 140th exoneree of the United States. There's 150 right now.
That's
100
just death row exonerees.
That's death row exonerees. It's 150 times they have sat there and said, these people are the butchers, the murderers, the lowest scum of this society. And those are just the ones we found.
I'm gonna just. I know that it's getting late and people need other places to go. Joe and I will stay here. If you want to take us to the local hangout and sit around and ask questions, we'll be glad to do that too. But we'll stay as long as anybody wants to ask questions. I do want to tell just two
Oh, come on.
stories.
No, don't listen to him. No.
Joe gets out on a Friday. He gets out Friday, March 5th, 2010. And after a impromptu party that gets planned for him, I said to him, Joe, let's get away for the weekend and let's go someplace. He says, where do you want to go? And I said, I only got the weekend. We got to go someplace where we can drive. It said, what about Chicago, Toronto, or DC? And it was the beginning of March. He wanted to go someplace where it might be a little warmer, so he thought south to DC would be appropriate. And he wanted to see the Supreme Court, where he knew his case would eventually end up. So we got in the car and we went to DC. On about 5 o'clock on Saturday morning before we left, I went on to Priceline.com and I punched in $91 for a 5-star hotel in DC. It's last minute. I thought they don't want those rooms sitting empty. So I got it. I got this 5-star boutique hotel 2 blocks from the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. And so we pull up in front of the hotel. We valet the car. We go in, and I'm forgetting that he has not been outside in 20-something years. And so I walk into the hotel room, and I throw my knapsack on my bed, and I turn around, and he's standing in the doorway. He hasn't come into the room. And I'm thinking, you should be a little bit more sensitive here. This has got to be overwhelming. And this was, it had a large room.
Huge room.
It had a dressing room, and then had another room for the shower and the commode off the dressing room. And he stands there in the doorway, and he looks around, and he looks up in the corner of the room, and he sees a little peel of wallpaper and a small little water stain. And he throws his knapsack on the bed. And as serious as can be, he looks at me and he says, this place is a dump.
Now, in my defense, this is a $500 a night room. If you're paying $500 a night for a room, should there be a water stain and peeling?
The ex-death row inmates in a hotel room after 22 years in an 8x10 cell, and he says it's a dump. And I says, at least the commode has its own room, for God's sake. So that night, I want to take him out for his first steak dinner as a free man, and we're going down M Street in Georgetown. Exclusive restaurants, left and right. And so we're standing at one of the restaurants looking at the menu case. And he's looking over my shoulder, and he says, Neil, he says, I think this is an awful expensive restaurant. And I says, what makes you think so, Joe? And he's looking for the description of the item, ... $, and the price. And this had, and he said to me, there's no prices on the menu. That's what he was looking for. But what it had was the description of the item, subset price with no $. And I said, Joe, that's the price. And he says, oh, no way. He says, I thought that was the number that you ordered by.
Because it was huge.
So we go in, tablecloths, 4 forks, 4 spoons, 4 knives, crystal everywhere. And we're looking at the menu, and he's looking over it, and you can see he's a little nervous, and he's never been in a place like this. And he says, I think I'm going to get the chicken. And I said, the chicken? I said, Joe, I thought you wanted a steak. And he says, well, I do. And I says, well, then why are you going to get the chicken? He says, because it's not as expensive. And I said, get the damn steak!
It was very expensive steak.
And Joe, he eats very fast because he gets his tray through the food slot, and he's got so much time to eat it, and then the tray has to come back.
Or
and he has to get it back. So he eats so doggone fast. And he's sitting there, and he finishes eating, and the next thing you know, he's got every single plate, spoon, cup, everything stacked symmetrically up in a pile. I said, Joe, tablecloths, no stacking. But it's that kind of stuff. He doesn't do well for long periods of time in big crowds. He hasn't been around big crowds in 20-something years. He does okay, and then you'll notice that he kind of slinks off for a little bit, gets away for himself, has a cigarette, and then he'll come back. He'll come back, but he doesn't do well for long periods of time in enclosed spaces. This guy can fall asleep in 15 seconds, and he'll sleep through a hurricane. But if you want to wake him up, because he thinks it's jailer's keys.
They're coming in.
And so it's the only thing that will wake him up like that.
I mean, an atomic bomb can go off and I wouldn't hear it.
But his education, his career, his dating, ability to marry and have a family. I wouldn't want my sister dating him.
Wait a minute, you got cute sisters.
But I joke about it, but, think about it here for a minute. Joe, if he meets somebody, he has to be up front and center immediately with his past. Because
Not a good starting question.
if he
with the
doesn't
girl-
tell
with
it
the
to
girl.
him, and they find it out by Googling him, and they're going to, then he's got a problem. And so if he's in a social situation where he meets somebody through somebody else, like if I've got a group of people that I'm with, and I introduce him to this young lady, and she knows me, and she goes out with a group of us, she gets to know Joe, and she can get past the fact that he was incarcerated on death row. But that doesn't mean her dad's going to get past it, or her brothers, or
Uncles.
her uncles. It's a real problem. So they have robbed this man of a lifetime, and he's never going to get it back. He's doing extremely well. There's no doubt about that. He's doing extremely well. He's got a good job. He's got benefits. He's got a great support system. But we can't give him back 23 years. And nobody will ever be able to do that. And trust me, and Joe, we both know this too. We've talked around the country and even overseas. We know that a lot of people are going to say, you're the man that got away with murder. It's just the reality that he has to live with. And it's just what goes on. And so it's, again, it's a story, but it happened. And it happened in the last several years. And so the story, as any good story, must challenge us. Any good story must call us to literally look at our deepest held beliefs and reevaluate them and say, can I still believe this? Or in light of the story, what ought I to do?
Tell them about the quote.
And we have to, the what?
The quote.
What quote?
From the philosopher. Justice is incidental.
Oh yeah, I forget who the philosopher was that said this, but ours is a society where justice is accidental and innocence affords no protection. Ours is a society where justice is accidental and innocence affords no protection. That's a long ago philosopher. But is it true? Should it be true? And if it shouldn't, what ought we to do? And so there's the story, there's the questions, and if we just stimulate thinking and classroom conversation and critical, not from the gut, but from up here. I can literally debate with you every single argument for the death penalty. Gender, race, economy, geography, all of those kinds of things. There's one, I will win them all. I guarantee it. I will lose one every time, and that's vengeance. If you want vengeance, I'm lost. I can't argue with it. You win. But I'm not sure that's what we're about. And I'm not sure that's what we should be about. So thank you for having us. We will be here as long as anybody has any questions.
I can have your attention for 5 more minutes before you head out.
Oh, come on.
Thank you so much for telling your story this evening. I think your story is a great reminder about the criminal justice system is about people, and it should be the search for justice. And sometimes it gets lost. in the process, in the logistics. I think Father Neil's story is a great lesson with human kindness and compassion, mercy, and also the tenacity of working through the appeal process. And also a good lesson that you can't have too many degrees, nursing, an attorney, and a priest as well.
Didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up.
He still don't.
We'd also like to extend our thanks to you from our student leaders. If you want to come up, Alicia Harrison is the president of our mock trial team, and Matt Goddard is the president of the Criminal Justice Honor Society.
Thank you very much.
I thought it was a Frisbee. Cool.
It's a gift of time, considering so much time
Nice.
taken from you.
Perfect.
So it's a
That works.
Mercyhurst University clock.
I need a clock.
As well as some other gifts from the bookstore, that has Mercyhurst University
Thank you.
on there.
Kid in a candy store.
And I left the battery out so it didn't seem like it was ticking bomb or something, but, we're providing it as well. So, again, let's thank, Joe and Father Neil for coming today. And I feel like I can say class dismissed as well. Thank you all for coming.
Let's go down here and stand by the